Hi guys, my name is Charlie and welcome to my podcast, Dead Name. Um, Today's video is going to be a little different. Different in the sense that like I guess it's a book review and then also a think piece at the same time. But mainly a book review, and I'll just be giving my thoughts about the subject. Um but the book review is on this book that I found at Half Price Books. When I went into the psychology section and I really wanted to find a book that was gonna like make my brain a little more wrinkly. You know what I mean? Because I was like, it's just like really hard for me to read fiction these days. I feel like I've read everything at this point, and that could be a different video on its own. But this book is called The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon W Allport, and it is an exploration slash study on the roots of prejudice and um like why it happens, what it is, how it affects people. Um and I I I will probably make more videos, but this will just be a review on the first 30 pages that I've read. Because it is so information dense. This will probably be like a 30-minute to hour long video. Um and just due to the nature of the subject, right? But I, so far, I love this book. The way that he writes is very captivating in the sense where, like, he's not just like spitting data points at you and, just like giving you statistics, but he actually like humanizes the data and like words it in a way that is easy, one, to digest, but then also to apply that to your own life. And it is like, while you read about prejudice, like it also makes you think about yourself, and I think that is a very rare quality to find in a book that is supposed to be a study on something. At least for me personally, I get, I don't know if it's because I have ADHD or because I have a low attention span, but like I get very bored when I read books that are just statistics over and over again. Like it feels like I'm reading a textbook in for a class, and I don't like to read things like that unless I'm specifically researching something. And this I wanted to read and to enjoy. And so far that's been my experience with the book 30 pages in. But I guess I will just start and kind of go over the topics that he has gone over in these 30 pages. So first he kind of starts with breaking it down, and there's like a very natural progression in which he explains prejudice and like introduces prejudice. Um, but in my own words, I will explain it because I don't want this to be a review where I just like read off the fucking book the whole time. But basically, as humans, we have an unconscious, like a way of unconsciously grouping people, places, and things into categories. The unconscious background work that your brain does to kind of protect you from things like stress, danger, discomfort, and it kind of fuels the way that you think about your everyday life, and your opinions on like every aspect of life. That protection usually forms itself in the way of generalization, which has earned a bad reputation, but in its really like purest form, it's just like the act of subdued discernment. So you take people, places, and things, reference personal or anecdotal experience, and you form an opinion based off that. And then you therefore apply that opinion to like later things that you encounter that remind you of the former. So on a personal level, it can be as simple as I like cake. I had cake once and it was good. All cake is good. Or in the negative, it could be I had broccoli once. I hated it. All broccoli is bad. Um, and that even goes deeper into things that he explains in the book called Love Prejudice and Hate Prejudice. And essentially, what it means is that prejudice is just like a belief system that has both like positive and negative qualities that you associate with people, places, and things. Um, it's like with the cake, like you had it once and now you think all cake is good, but that does not actually mean all cake is good. If you make it more complex, it's like sometimes you can only really like cake with buttercream like frosting, or maybe like you don't like really dense cake, you like more airy fluffy cake, or with broccoli, like maybe you just had broccoli cooked a way that you didn't like. um and if you tried a different dish, like it doesn't just because you had one dish with broccoli in it that was bad doesn't necessarily mean that all broccoli that you will ever try therefore after is going to be bad. But that prejudice that you have you know, created towards broccoli makes you more averse to it in the future. You'll be less likely to eat broccoli if you've had a bad experience with it once in the past. And that's like in its like most basic form. Um, so anecdotally, it could be something along the lines of like, my friend says melatonin gives her nightmares. I will find another sleep aid. I'm going to treat you guys like you are smart because I believe you are. And I will not just like explain everything to like the very most minute detail. You can take that as it is. Therefore, he goes on to say that like life's just not as simple as liking cake or taking advice on sleep aids, right? So, like, especially when something that can be applied to nature or objects becomes a tool for discerning people, it takes away the complexity of human life. It does not suffice. It might have when things were maybe simpler, but now that we live in a modern age, and maybe you could even argue it's never been that simple, but even now in the modern age, I feel like things are so complex. There's so much going on and so many different things, especially with like intersectionality of identity and like, politics and the way social media works. Like you, you cannot just generalize people, because it does not serve you the way that it might have served people way back when, right? Um, but anyways, this kind of thinking, when you apply generalization and prejudice towards people, is where it became infamous, and there are different kinds of generalizations. So there is the two kinds I mentioned before, which is personal or anecdotal, and then there is generalization that's made through hearsay. So it's hearsay is an anecdote, whether made honestly or dishonestly, transformed into scripture, spread through word of mouth or text, and redefined as a singular truth. Um, and so an example is a majority of townspeople all avoid the woods on the outskirt of town because there is a rumor that a serial killer lives in them. Whether the serial killer truly lives there is moot because the townspeople agree that those woods are dangerous and they warn newcomers to do the same. Now take that framework, like the cake, the broccoli, the sleep aid, the the woods, right? And now apply it to a person of color or a black person. So now you have a white boy in the fourth grade hears his dad talking to his pool buddies in the garage about a story he overheard at the bar. In the town over, a black man was accused of breaking into somebody's home. The white boy then becomes fearful when he sees a black man walking outside their home the next day. Or a woman in China grows up being told by her parents that all Latino people are members of the cartel and thieves. She applies this doctrine to her belief system and, when seeing posts about Mexicans suffering at the hands of ICE, genuinely thinks that they deserve it. Those are examples of hearsay. And generalizing people is a form of prejudice, and it may serve a purpose when dealing with natural disasters and objects. It eradicates the complexity of human life when applied to the living, which I said before. And so in The Nature of Prejudice, Allport describes his definition of prejudice. It's very specific, because there can be many different iterations of it, but he specifically for his book is using ethnic prejudice is an antipathy based upon a faulty and inflexible generalization. It may be felt or expressed. It may be directed towards a group of people or an individual because he is a member of that group. And so with that, I ask you to hold that definition and other definitions that you may know of or hold personally simultaneously throughout the review. And like I said, as I keep reading and finding new things that I enjoy about the book, I will probably post a new review. But he goes on to say that the thing about prejudice is that it is not the same as racism. Prejudice is the belief system that enables racism. Racism is the systemic outcome of prejudice. So, and I think that is something that I see a lot happening in the modern age when it comes to prejudice, is that it usually synonymously gets grouped in with racism. And like people will use both kind of interchangeably. But after reading this book and also even beforehand, never really thought that they were the same thing. And after reading this book, it really opened up my eyes because it just kind of like gave me the words to describe how I felt this whole time, where it's like, yeah, like that makes total sense. Like prejudice from what I've experienced in my life was not necessarily racism, but it was the thing that fueled racism, you know? Um, then that kind of leads you into thinking about things such as what separates prejudice from just a incorrect prejudgment, you know? Because I think you can be naive or you can be uninformed and you can have a negative idea about a certain group of people or a thing, and then and then some people may be hasty to call that a prejudice, but Allport explains it as such. And this is not verbatim, but this is my rewording of it. An incorrect prejudgment is simply that. A mistake made in judgment that, for the most part, can be easily corrected with facts and moved on from. Prejudice, however, tends to be met with more emotional pushback. That is because prejudice is not simply a thought. It's not just something that you were uninformed about or that you heard of and then kind of just were like, oh, and ran with it, right? It is a belief system, and it tends to lend itself to a lot of rationalization when it is met with facts. And I've seen this mental gymnastics kind of start to happen when prejudiced people get faced with facts. And it's really impressive, honestly. But here's like an example conversation for reference. Person A says all black people are thugs and liars. Person B says your black neighbor is a lawyer and an active member in the town council. Person A says he probably cheated his way through school, and he's just doing that to further cover the asses of the rest of the thugs in town. Person B says, have you ever met a black person who is a thug? Person A says, I don't need to. You see it all over the news. Then person B says, what about all the white people who commit crimes on the news? And then that's usually the point where people either become like very aggressive or they just like leave the conversation completely. The real question is more so, what does prejudice thinking serve the prejudiced person? And that is what Allport talks about in his book. He explains that it comes from two main routes of thinking. So there's the emotional route, and it usually involves things like dignity, pride, ego that get in the way. A person, in many ways, may be reasonable and agreeable. In other circumstances, may become irrational and defensive in light of having their prejudices challenged. For example, a popular influencer whose brand is built around right-wing talking points enters a debate with somebody more qualified than them. They refuse to acknowledge other points made against their belief system because to acknowledge they may be wrong in some light is to discredit everything they've built. And then there's social. A person may not choose to challenge their beliefs or update their beliefs based on reality because of the people they liken themselves with. So, a person who lives in a conservative town and many of their family members and close friends are conservative. They've grown up being taught to believe negative stereotypes about other races and internally recognize that to admit those teachings are wrong would risk being shunned by their loved ones. It's not that prejudice is some exotic moral dilemma, but more of an accumulation of otherwise harmless human tendencies applied to people in situations that cannot be generalized. Humans tend to prefer the simpler route when given the choice. When available, avoiding stress makes life easier, and it is considerably more work to make the statement, all people are complex and must be evaluated on an individual basis, than X people are lazy, dumb, and annoying, or whatever other negative thing you'd like to list there. And like even in myself, like I recognize that I have my own prejudices towards white people and men. But I also actively do the work to fight against it when it's possible. I engage respectfully with those people and those demographics, and I update my opinions, but the belief lingers as like a form of protection because in my past, I have been a victim to many different types of harm caused by white people or men. Um, and that's not to say those are the only demographics that hurt me, but the large majority of them were. I've internalized in some way that, every white man or every white person that I meet may cause me harm. And that's not to say that every time I meet them, I'm going to accuse them of being somebody who harms, but it's like in the back of my mind, like I do think about that. I do fear for that. And it does inform the way that I maybe interact with them. I may be more hesitant to befriend somebody who is a man or befriend somebody who is white because of these previous experiences that I've had. But I don't let that rule my life. And in reading this book, it actually made me realize that I am a prejudiced person. And I think a lot of us want to live our life believing that we're not prejudiced, especially if you tend to be on the more progressive side of things. There's always this in and out group of like people who are prejudiced being on the outside and people who are not prejudiced being on the inside. But the thing is that like everybody is prejudiced in some kind of way. And that kind of brings me back to the whole thing about love prejudice and hate prejudice. I have hate prejudice towards white people and men. I also have a love prejudice towards queer people, Black people, and people of color in general, and women as well. Um, the people who have hurt me in the past were not only white or not only men. Like I have been hurt and betrayed and harmed by queer people, Black people, people of color, other women, like I have been harmed by them too, but I hold a love prejudice towards them. So even when I've been met with the fact of being harmed by those people as well, um, I have rationalized a lot of things and I have not taken it as deeply as I took the harm from the white men in general. I haven't taken it as personally. I haven't internalized it as much. And that is due to my love prejudice. Um, and to go on a different topic from that, there is this thing that he goes on to describe in his book. I have noticed this phenomenon of something I would like to call the good ones. You may already know what I'm talking about when I say the good ones. Um, but in the good ones section, basically, I will describe that a belief system can still function even when it's confronted with reality, because the natural reaction to maintain two things at once is what Allport coined as refencing. So essentially, it's the act of making exceptions, and you see it in many cases of prejudice met with an opposing reality. In terms of ethnic prejudice, people create a category called the good ones. And these are people who do not fit within the restrictive beliefs a prejudiced person may hold, but to some degree may serve a purpose in the prejudiced person's life, and therefore they earn their place at the table as an exception. This can be for status, to prove a point, or to aid in condemning those who don't behave as such to abide up a prejudiced person's standards. A heavily conservative teen may be friends with a Chinese peer, while also believing that all Chinese immigrants are communists. Because their friend is not a communist, he must be one of the good ones, who broke away from his natural programming. On the surface, this may seem like progression, actually. Like the conservative teen is learning to distinguish reality between their belief system. But I personally believe that this creates a paradox because it leaves no room for nuance from their Chinese friend. In the case that their Chinese friend may say something mildly in favor of communism or to the degree that may challenge this ideal good one that the conservative teen has built, he will very quickly realize that he is disposable. The belief system will remove the exception without friction. I've briefly experienced what it's like to be a good one before, and I've also recognized in myself this exact like exception to not exception pipeline in my own thinking. Um, it's the first one that comes to mind. In college, I was part of this group chat. I'm interacting with like all kinds of people in that group chat. I'm being very nice. And just like trying to make friends. And there was this one couple, and they happened to be white. And we were just talking, and like it was all fun and games at first. And then a black student made a group chat for black students only to go and meet other students who were just like them, you know? And that nothing wrong with that, right? But the couple I mentioned before, the white couple, they became furious that they were being disregarded in this group chat. They were not allowed in this group chat. And I called them out on it. I got into an argument with them in the middle of the public group chat. I called them like entitled and racist. And immediately they went from being like so nice to me, being so reasonable, so amicable, to being just like absolute like seedy bastards. And then I found out later that they had actually just always been this way. They were like very, very, very adamant Trump supporters. Like they were extremely conservative and like extremely racist and homophobic on top of that. And as a queer person of color and also who's somebody who is trans identifying, like it was like a weird experience to like interact with them. And then in the way that I have applied this like refencing idea to my own life is like before, back when I was much younger and I was still dating men, I would date these men, and I would look at certain traits, like if they had painted nails or if they listened to indie music and like they had superficial politics. I believed they were good men. And then the minute that they treated me poorly or they did anything kind of like shitty to me, I immediately started believing again that all men are bad or all men are the same. And so like it didn't matter that like I had had this belief before, like I made exceptions for them. And the minute that they broke my ideal or they showed a human tendency to like not always be perfect, I immediately grouped them back up with like the bad men. And so, yeah, like that's pretty much like all that I've read of the book so far and all the topics that he's covered thus far. But I really love it. And the next section that I'm going to be getting to in the book is going to be discussing the concept of in groups and out groups, and what necessarily connotates and governs what an in group is, and then therefore what then determines an out group and how those two things interact. And I will come back once I've read, hopefully maybe like 30 pages more or just enough to make another video. I will come back with more information for you guys. But thank you for watching. That has been my review on Gordon W Allport's book, The Nature of Prejudice. I hope that this has sparked some interest for you. Hopefully you go and pick up this book or an audiobook version of it soon. And we can both be on the same page together next time. Have a great day or night and take care.